Welcome back. If you look at the syllabus, you'll see that we're about where we're supposed to be. We've been talking about using Python as a back-end language to run server-side scripts. And we've learned how to take information from a form and process it in Python and save it to a file so that we can retrieve it later and display it in a different web page. But what we're talking about today is a little bit different. We're actually going to jump ahead in the syllabus a little bit and talk about cookies today, because it fits really nicely in what we've been learning about form data and processing Python scripts. And then we're going to go back and we'll talk a little bit about templating languages and how we can use Python to generate templates for web pages so we don't have to type the same HTML code over and over. We can do an important computer science principle called code reuse. So that's where we're headed. But today we're going to talk about cookies, and then we're going to come back to cookies a little bit to talk about security implications later in the course. So to set this up a little bit and provide some motivation, let's talk really briefly about why we need cookies. So we've been using forms, and forms are one way that we can share information from the client to the server. We can send information that the user types into those form fields to the server can store it and manipulate it and do other kinds of useful things. But forms are only one way that the server can provide information to the client, and the client can communicate with the server. And one of the other ways that we can communicate is to use cookies. And so what is a cookie? Well, a cookie is a small piece of information, just a short string really, that's stored by the web browser. Something like a username or a session ID. And that little tiny piece of information is sent from the web browser to the server every time the web browser requests a new page. So the web browser will say, hey server, give me this page. Oh, and by the way, here are some cookies for you. This information, this information, this information. And those pieces of information are just sent in the HTTP header. Cookies are used for many different things. Originally, they were used for shopping carts, but today they're more often used for credentialing, for authentication. So if you go to a website that has many different pages, you don't want to have to type in your username and password every time you access a different page of the website. And so what you can do is you can set a cookie, and when you visit the website, you'll log in, that will create the cookie, and then from then on other pages, instead of having to type a username and password, the web server can just look at your cookie and say, oh yeah, you've proved that you logged in. So sometimes websites remember your username and password and they send those in cookies, but a more secure way is to create something called a session key. The first time you log in, your credentials are stored in a database temporarily, your username and your password, and those are actually, your password may not be stored, it may just be checked. But your username is going to be stored in a database, and the server is going to generate a unique key, a session key, to go with your username. And then that session key will be sent back to your browser, and your browser can use that session key to prove that you've logged in. And so every time you go to a different page, your browser will send the session key. The server will check the session key against the database and say, oh yeah, username Bob has logged in, so I'm going to let Bob in to this page too. And that way you don't have to keep typing in your credentials. We can also store other session information. For example, settings. If I have logged into my webmail and I don't like the theme, I can go to some sort of settings menu and change the theme to a brighter theme, or maybe a pink theme or a dark theme. And the server doesn't have to remember that information because we can store those configuration settings in a cookie that will be stored in the web browser. And every time I connect to webmail from that same browser, it's going to send cookies that say, oh yeah, give Dr. Marmerstein a brown theme. And my theme will be brown for the day. I already mentioned that one thing that we can do with cookies is keep track of items in a shopping cart. So when you click to add an item to a cart, instead of actually doing anything on the server, often a website will just make a JavaScript change. It'll use JavaScript to add a cookie. And so every item you add, maybe we've got some sort of product ID number, we'll create a cookie that says, oh yeah, this product ID goes in the cart too. And then when you check out, your browser will fetch all of those cookies with product IDs and send them to the server. The server will read through all those cookies and make some sort of purchase order and do some transaction to make your purchase happen. Cookies can also be used to remember form data. Obviously, login credentials are one form of that, but also they can be used to remember other kinds of things that you type into a form, credit card numbers and so forth. So there are a lot of security concerns surrounding cookies. One of them is whether cookies can be intercepted. If I type in my credit card number on one website and it's stored as a cookie, can other websites somehow access that cookie in my browser, because if they can, that's really dangerous. We've got some pretty good protections against that. And the same origin policy, for instance, that prevents cross-site scripting. Something similar is applied to cookies. So cookies can only be accessed from the same domain. But there are ways that attackers get around some of these restrictions, and it's something we have to worry about. We'll talk more about security concerns with cookies later in the course. Turns out there are actually two kinds of cookies. Session cookies are cookies that are only stored temporarily. They're stored in your web browser, and they're deleted automatically after you close the browser. There are also persistent cookies. Those last for a specified amount of time or until a certain date. So a persistent cookie lasts more than one session. If I close the browser and open it again, when I log back into the website, it still remembers that information. So session cookies are usually used for logins. If I log in, I get a session ID, and as long as I haven't closed the browser, I can still interact with that website. When I close the browser and open it again, I have to log back in. Persistent cookies are used for other things, like configuration settings for the interface. Or maybe for shopping cart. You know, I don't necessarily want to lose all the things I put in my shopping cart when I close the browser. Cookies consist of 3 different parts. Every cookie has a name, a value, and a list of attributes. So this is an example cookie. The name is ID, and the value is student 37. So we say the name, an equal sign, and then the value. And then we can have a list of attributes, and the list of attributes uses semicolons to separate the different parts. So here I've said the ID number is student 37, and I want to set these attributes. It's an HTTP only cookie that expires at this date and time. We'll talk more about what the attributes mean in a bit. So the names and the values can contain any ASCII character, except they can't have commas or semicolons in them, and they also can't have white space. So I can't say like ID gets Joseph space Barnes. That doesn't work because I can't have spaces in the value. However, I can use percent encoding, like %20 or something, or I can use HTML encoding, ampersand NBSP for a non-breaking space. I can do lots of different things to encode a space and put that in. I just can't have an actual space in my value. Values can contain an equal sign, but names can't. The reason for that is that we separate the name from the value with an equal sign. So if you have a name that contains an equal sign, it'll think the first part of the name is the name, and then when it sees the equal sign, it'll think you're ready to tell it the value. So you can't have equal signs in a name. The server can request that the browser store a cookie by sending it a special header, the set cookie header. So here is an example HTTP transaction. Remember, with HTTP, the client initiates the transaction. The client dials in and sends an HTTP request, and we get back an HTTP response from the server. So the client's going to send a request, and this request is get/login.html using version HTTP 1.1. And then we also send a header, the host header, that says, and I want the web page for the host, marmerstein.org. So we're going to look for marmerstein.org/login.html. So the server goes to the disk and finds login.html, and it's very happy. It sends back a response, and that response is HTTP/1.1, because that's the version of HTTP we've both agreed to use, and then 200 OK. Everything worked. I found the file. And then it sends a bunch of HTTP headers. It sends a date header. The content type header you should be familiar with because we've been using it in Python. So content type text HTML. The content I'm going to send you is a web page. And then a very special header, a set cookie header. And the set cookie header sets views to 1. So basically, we're counting how many times we've logged into the website, and we're saying this is the first view. And then we have our payload, which of course is the HTML for the login page. So when the web browser gets that reply, that HTTP response, it's going to see the set cookie header, and it's going to actually store in a little internal database the information that the number of views is 1. And now, every time it talks to that web server, every time it requests a page from marmerstein.org, it's going to send that cookie back to the server. So the next time we fetch a page is going to look something like this. Get/page2.html, whatever page 2 is, HTTP/1.1. And I'll still send my host header, host:/marmerstein.org. But then I'll have to send a special header called cookie. Cookie:/views gets 1. Every time the web browser talks to that server, it's required to send that cookie as a header. And the server can ignore it. Or if it's some kind of script, we could use that information to do something. Maybe we could display the number of views in the web page that we send back. So in addition to being able to set a value, we can set some attributes. So some of the common attributes that we set are the secure attribute. The secure attribute basically means that we will only send that cookie when we're using HTTPS, not when we're using HTTP. Remember, the difference is that HTTPS connections are encrypted, and so they're private, whereas HTTP connections are fast, but they're not encrypted. Anybody who can intercept our traffic can see the information. Another attribute is the HTTP only attribute. That basically says don't allow the cookie to be accessed in any way other than the HTTP communication. So for example, the web browser is not allowed to expose that cookie to the JavaScript engine. So if you want to try to get to that cookie from JavaScript, you're out of luck because we've set the HTTP only attribute. That's a good security protection. A lot of web pages have scripts that run as part of the advertising. The web developers of that website didn't write that script. Their ad service that they're using to generate revenue is embedding JavaScript into those pages. And that JavaScript can do things like fetch all the cookies for this page. So unless you want some third party reading your cookies, you should probably set them HTTP only. Another property is the domain. The domain property, the domain attribute, restricts viewing of the cookie to servers in a particular domain. So for example, if I only want marmerstein.org to be able to read my cookie, I could set the domain to marmerstein.org. And then marmerstein.org could read the cookie, and any subdomain, for example, www.marmerstein.org could read the cookie. Robert.marmerstein.org could read the cookie. If I wanted to set the domain to longwood.edu, then only servers at longwood.edu could read the cookie. Canvas.longwood.edu could read it, but canvas.hamptonsydneycollege.edu couldn't. Another way to restrict who can view the cookie is to use the path attribute. The path attribute says, okay, you've restricted it by domain, but we're going to further restrict it to only this set of web pages. So if you remember, the path is the part of the URL that comes after the domain. So for example, on marmerstein.org, we have /twiddlerobert. If I set /twiddlerobert to my path attribute, only things on my web page could view the cookie, not things on my wife's web page. One of the most important attributes, probably the most important attribute, is the expires attribute. And this determines when the web browser is supposed to delete the cookie. So we can say at this particular time, on this day, this minute, this second, delete the cookie. So to set attributes, we use setCookie, just like we do to create the cookie in the first place. But we put a semicolon separated list of attributes afterward. So here the web browser is requesting a page, login.html, on hostmarmerstein.org, just like it did before. And now we're going to send back a setCookie header. But instead of just saying views gets 1, we're going to say views gets 1, semicolon, and we can set the expires attribute to Monday, the 31st of October, 2016, 1 minute before midnight. Now, Halloween was several days ago. It's already passed. What's going to happen to that cookie? Well, when the web browser gets this HTTP response, it's going to look at that expires attribute and say, oh, the views cookie has already expired, and it's going to delete it. So this is a way to delete a cookie. The only way to delete a cookie is to use the expires attribute to mark it as already expired, and then it'll be deleted by the browser. We're also going to set a cookie named last on, and we're going to set it to 2 November 2016. So this basically says that this user was last on November 2nd of this year. We're going to set the secure attribute so that we only see this if we're using the HTTPS communication protocol. We're going to set HTTP only so it can't be accessed from JavaScript. And we're going to set it to expire on Monday, December 7th at 1 minute before midnight Greenwich Mean Time. And then, of course, we'll have the payload, the HTML of the page that we requested, the login screen. So the views cookie has now been deleted, but we've created a new cookie named last on. And now, every time we send a request to that web server, to marmerstein.org, such as this one, where I'm getting page 2, we're going to send a cookie header But we're not going to send the views header because that's been deleted. We're only going to send a cookie for the last on cookie, and we're going to say last on is 2nd November 2016. Notice that we don't send the attributes. The attributes just tell the web browser how to manage the cookie, how to store it and how to use it, when to send it, when not to send it. They aren't actually part of the cookie itself. So we don't send them when we send the cookie to the server. We only send the name and the value. So how can we use this? Well, we can use this in Python. So for example, when we're generating a new web page, we've already been printing out some HTTP headers. We've been printing out content type : text/HTML. And that tells the web browser that the page that it's loading is an HTML web page. Well, we can now also print a set cookie header that sets a cookie like this one. We can say color is blue. So we're setting the cookie named color to be blue. Then, of course, we print a blank line, and we print our doc-type HTML and the rest of our web page. If we want to fetch cookies in a CGI script, we have to use a special piece of code called the cookie module. So the way that we do that in Python 3 is we say from HTTP import cookies. In Python 2, this used to be done differently. You would just import cookie with a capital C. But cookie is gone, and in Python 3, the correct way to do this is to import cookies from HTTP, the HTTP module. We're also going to need to import the OS module, or operating system module, because the way that a web server sends cookies to a script is to put the cookie into an environment variable named HTTP cookie. And so we have to be able to access the operating system and get that environment variable. So the first thing we do is we create what's called a cookie jar. We do that by saying cookies.simpleCookie. That will create a basic cookie jar that can hold lots of cookies. And then we load all of the cookies from the web server into our script by saying cookiejar.load. And in parentheses, we have to tell it where to get the cookies from. And we can do that with os.environ.get. And then in double quotes, we say HTTP cookie. Notice that I have a comma there and then the empty string. The reason for that is that if it can't find the cookie, maybe there aren't any cookies, it needs to know what default value to use. So it'll say, OK, if there is no cookie, we're going to use the empty string for our default value. And now I want to get that color cookie. Remember, we set color to blue. So I'm going to create a variable named color. Initially, I'm going to set it to the empty string. That's going to be sort of a default value. And then I'm going to say, if there is a cookie named color in the cookie jar, fetch it. And the way I fetch it is I set color equal to cookiejar sub, and I use square brackets, the string color dot value. And so this is how I access the value of a cookie that's been retrieved in my cookie jar. I realize that there's a lot of steps here. The beauty of this is that I only have to do the cookie jar part once. Once I've got the cookie jar, I can get all of the cookies out of it by just doing things like I've done in this if statement. So I could have 2 or 3 or 4 more if statements, one for each cookie I want to try to access. So here's a more sophisticated example. So what I've done is I've created a simple HTML form that just asks you for your name. And when you click submit, it'll say your name is, and then ask you to type in your name again. And if you reload the page, it's supposed to remember your name. So here we go. It's a Python script, so we start with the magic, shebang user bin Python. I'm going to import the CGI module because I'm going to be accessing fields from a form. I'm just going to have one value that I retrieve from the form, a username. So I'm going to set that to be the empty string by default. And remember, the way that I access the fields in an HTML form is I use cgi.fieldStorage. So I'm going to use cgi.fieldStorage to fetch data values from a form and put them in an object named f. F is going to hold my form data. And then I can check if there's username in f. Then I can fetch the username by saying username gets f sub username.value. This is a little different from what I showed you before. This is the new Python 3 way to do things. So I can check if there's a form field named username with if username in f. And then I can say username gets f sub username.value. Another way I could do this is to use the getValue function in the CGI field storage object. Anyway, once I've retrieved the username, then I'm going to print out my web page. I print my content type header. I print a blank line. And then I print my web page. And my web page consists of a doc-type tag, an HTML tag, a head section with a title, and also I'm going to pull in a style sheet just to make things look a little bit nicer. And then I'm going to say, OK, if the username is not the empty string, if they did type in a username, print out your name is and the name they typed. So if I'm loading this page for the first time, they haven't typed in a username yet, so that won't print. But after I submit the form, it's going to reload the same page, but it's going to pass in that user information that I typed into the form. And so it'll print your name is Bob, your name is Henry, your name is George. OK, then I print some HTML for the form. The action is cookie.cgi, which is also the name of this script. So it's going to trigger the same script that prints this web page. I'm going to use the post method. I'm going to encode it as multi-part form data. And then just going to have a username field that's just a text input named username and a submit button. And that's my HTML. So if I load cookie.cgi up in a web browser, this is what I get. I have a username label, I have my input tag, and I have my submit query. Notice it didn't print your name is in the username yet because I haven't typed in a username. But if I type in the username George and click submit query, it'll say your name is George. But it's getting George from the form because I just submitted the form. If I go to another page and then type in cookie.cgi in the location bar to come back, it doesn't remember that my name is George. So if I want to remember the name, I need to use cookies. So here's what that looks like. The code in green is the new code. That's the code that I've added to make cookies work. So first of all, I have my from HTTP import cookies and my import OS, because that's how I'm going to load cookies from the web server. Then I'm going to use C for my cookie jar, because I couldn't fit cookie jar equals on the slide. So capital C is my cookie jar. I create a new cookie jar. I load cookies into that cookie jar from the operating system environment variables. And then I have an if statement that says if there is a username in the cookie jar, get its value. That should have been green. Let me fix that really quickly. This part right here is new. So let me fix that. Look at that. OK. So if the username is in the cookie jar, fetch its value. And then we do what we did before. If they type something into the form, we're going to use that username instead. So if they type in a new username, that's going to override the one we got from the cookie jar. And then when we print content type text/HTML, if the username is set, either from the previous cookie or from the form, we're going to print set cookie, and we're going to give the name, username, an equal sign, and the value will be what's in the username variable. So it's going to remember that whatever name we typed in is the username. So now, if I load the page, I haven't typed in a username yet, so it doesn't print your name is. But if I type in George and click submit query, it remembers my name is George, but it fetched this from the form. If I were to actually look at the HTTP response that generated this web page, I would see that there was a special header there, a set cookie header. So now my web browser is going to store a cookie that remembers that my username is George. And if I reload the page, it still remembers that my name is George, even though I didn't type it in, because it had it in the cookie. So that's how you use cookies in Python. We can also actually get to them from JavaScript if they're not HTTP-only cookies. So the way that you set or modify a cookie in JavaScript is to use document.cookie. So I can say document.cookie gets username gets George. That would create a new cookie named username and set it to George. If I want to later modify the cookie, I can do the same thing. I can say document.cookie gets username gets Fred. And that would change the username from George to Fred. So it would delete the original cookie and create a new one named username with a different value. Notice that if I have multiple cookies, I still say document.cookie gets. If I have several different cookies, they don't replace each other. Document.cookie looks like a variable, but it's actually not a variable. It's a special JavaScript object that behaves in a strange way. When you assign to it, it doesn't replace the existing value. It just appends new cookies to this internal list. So it's this weird thing. If I say document.cookie gets username equals George, and then I say document.cookie gets views gets 1, it won't replace username gets George with views gets 1. It'll have both of them. It'll store both of them. And if I print out document cookie, maybe by doing an alert like I've done here in point 2, it'll actually show me all the cookies. It'll show me username is George and views is 1. I can delete a cookie. The only way I can delete a cookie, though, is to set its expires attribute to some date in the past. So, for example, if I no longer want to remember that the username is George, I can set document.cookie. Excuse me. I can set document.cookie to username equals George, semicolon, expires equals Tuesday, 6th of March, 1979, 000 UTC. And that will delete the cookie because March 6, 1979 was 37 years ago. There are a lot of security and privacy concerns about cookies. And the main thing that people worry about is that cookies can be used to track your web history. Remember I mentioned that there are advertising sites that sell ads on many different web pages. Some of them sell ads to as many as 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 sites. And every time you visit any one of those sites, they get to run some JavaScript code that can manipulate your cookies. And so what they do is they store a special cookie that keeps track of the fact that you visited that site. And because the domain of that cookie is the domain of the third-party advertiser, not the domain of the website you're going to, when you visit one of those sites, they can see not only the cookie for that website, but for all the other websites that you visited that have advertising from that same company. Google makes most of their money selling that information that they collect with these cookies. So websites load ads. The ads run some sort of script that creates a cookie. And then they log all of these cookies to see which websites you visited. And they sell that information so they can do targeted marketing. Someone did a study on cookie use, and they found that the average number of cookies on a website is 10, but some websites have as many as 800 cookies that they store. You go to a website like Yahoo or something, it could be storing 800 separate cookies. Some of those are configuration settings and login session keys, but a lot of them are just to track you in your purchasing and web behavior. So on average, those cookies can be read by over 100 third-party domains. So a lot of people are getting that information, and they can see what you're doing on the web. So if you don't want people to know what you're doing on the web, you better disable cookies. So in summary, cookies can be used to remember information between sessions or within a session. They're stored in the web client, that is the web browser. They can be accessed from a Python CGI script, or they can be accessed from JavaScript. But they raise a lot of security and privacy concerns. Next time we're going to talk about templating languages. We're going to learn how to use a framework called Python Flask, which I think you'll really like. Have a good week.